Okay. So, I'd like to actually start with a fictional scenario. Well, actually, before I start with my fictional scenario, sorry, I've forgotten. Public interest journalism is the topic today, but what is public interest journalism? So, the Ethical Journalism Network comes up with a definition of this, and it points to the fact that when journalists say they work in the public interest, this becomes a justification for talking to the presidents and the prime ministers and the business leaders and asking those impertinent questions that we often do. So it's our justification, but what actually is it? It is something that whether or not we care about public affairs, whether or not we're engaged in reading the news or public life, public interest issues affect us all. So journalists, in a sense, act on behalf of the welfare of everyone in community. So it's about having a society that functions well, people having the information that they need to make sensible choices for their everyday lives, and also bigger decisions that happen every number of years about who will lead them, who they will delegate responsibility to. So this is the concept of public interest journalism in real life. But back to the fictional scenario, I, Robot with Will Smith. The scenario is one that actually troubles many people about driverless cars today, because there's no driver there. If you're about to hit somebody, but it comes at the cost of, well, you can't avoid killing somebody. Someone's going to die in this accident. You've got to make the choice of do you swerve this way or that way, or does the driver die, or does the person on the road die? This is the scenario, and the lead character hates robots because he is actually so embedded in warm logic, it actually becomes a fault. He does not trust robots anymore because his car went into a waterway. There were 2 people to be saved, and he believes the robot should have saved the child, not himself. But the robot used cold logic and rescued him instead because he was statistically far more likely to survive than the child. And his comment is very, as if it's a matter of fact. Of course, a human would have saved the child. Because we have, in the English, the saying, save the women and children first when there's a disaster. And yet that logic is hardly universal or culturally accepted. An example in China a number of years ago was when a university student jumped into a river or stream to rescue a peasant farmer who was drowning, and in the process saved the farmer but died, the student died. And there was a lot of public debate about why would someone important like a student, an educated person, risk themselves for a nothing like a patani. So, that sense of what was worth saving was very much culturally grounded and very subjective. So there was no absolute, yes, of course you would have saved the child. And of course the issue around driverless cars is that a driver with only half a second to make a decision will often not make a decision at all. It's just what was, an instinct or maybe no response at all. So whatever the car was doing is what the car did. And on the other hand, the movie is also driven by this series of events, and it turns out that there is this super smart computer that controls all the robots, and it has calculated that the robots need to control humans. They create a curfew that humans have to be inside after certain hours, and they control human behaviour because there is the fear that actually, the calculations show that if humans are left to their own devices, they will lead to the extinction of themselves and destroy their environments. Thus, the robot is more sensible. Now, in the news media, wouldn't we actually like that? Because journalists have for a long time claimed that their service of the public interest is based on the fact that they are objective and they tell the truth, and that they follow these norms of objectivity, which actually involve a lot of cold logic. The sense of being lacking bias, not being aligned to anything, not allowing your personal judgment to sway who gets included, that every perspective is included somehow or another, as if we can as humans do that. So to a certain extent, maybe do we want to actually, give the machine more power in this process? If we have a look at what humans are actually doing with our lovely warm logic, it may not always look all that inspiring. The Edelman Trust does a survey of 28 countries around the world each year, 32,200 people. And out of the people it surveyed for this year's survey, which came out a few months ago, it found that 50% of those surveyed, and we're talking about a lot of people around the world, including in Indonesia and my own country of Australia, 50% were disengaged in the sense that they do not consume news every week. 25%, a quarter, do consume news about once a week or more often. And then there are the amplifiers, those who do that, as well as circulating news and sharing with others. So then we couple this with some figures from the last year's report, which shows what they consider to be the human element of echo chamber in action, that 1 in 2 people actually said they actually liked politicians I trust in politicians even if they exaggerate the truth. All these figures about I'm 5 times more likely to ignore information that supports a position I don't actually believe in. So when we start to look at the warmth of human logic, we start to sometimes feel a bit nervous and not be so concerned about some of these things being handed over to machines as long as they are well programmed. So does that, in a sense, mean that we have nothing to worry about? As we go on, we have a look at the human-machine interaction, and these are some of the, only a small number of figures that Freedom Forum gathered. These are only a small number of examples of the humans driving, using technology in the machine for very negative uses, to spread fake news, to destabilise their societies, to spread hate and so on. So as the Guardian's editor-in-chief, Catherine Viner, has pointed to, in the digital age, it is possible to lie, to make mistakes, but spread your mistakes very widely, to cause major damage with what we actually do. So that might lead to some concerns about this warm logic that we all work on. For us, in terms of the impact, the public interest issues, what are the implications of all of this? So Strömbach and Shahata and Strömbach did a study in Sweden of how people learn from the news. And they looked at people who use traditional news, online news, and then just that social media feed. And one interesting finding that they learnt was that people actually do learn if they consume either traditional news from traditional news media or online news media. So news packaged in a traditional format, a lengthy story or at least a story of a few hundred words. When they got the drip feeds through social media, they were not actually learning much. They did not have much depth or breadth of what they were learning about due to the logic of the way that social media work. So if they actually used that to click onto a traditional online story or access stories, they did learn. But if it was just social media, then that tended to be around the preferences of themselves or what they were sent by friends. So they could learn quirky bits about specific things or major events that blew up, but there was not wide-ranging learning. So that's one thing. If public interest is about giving the people that information to make decisions about who to elect, how to run their societies, that's of concern. Then, of course, there's the late Benedict Anderson, who was, of course, a scholar of many things, including Indonesia. And he pointed to historically the importance of the newspaper in helping to create community identity and, in particular, national identity. So we can see that the nation is not absolutely a concrete thing, and that's something in particular that someone in Indonesia would know so well, the accident of colonialism coming here and then the fight for freedom. So there is no reason that particular nations exist the way they do. There is some form of communication that is necessary so that people start to imagine themselves as having some solidarity, some shared interest, some connection. And we know that even though nations are in some senses less important because we connect now with people around the globe far more easily, it is still the nation that that controls our government, that often controls our standard of prosperity, that collects our taxes, decides the education systems for our children and so on. So democracy is actually organised around the nation state. So if the news media no longer serves that kind of coordinating role of sharing certain common information that everyone learns about, what happens to our sense of collective identity? Oops, and I've just hit the wrong button. Sorry about that, everyone. Indonesia, of course, with its rich diversity, so many different groups, we know there has been this struggle for unity, and we know, of course, APRI has always been concerned about independence movements in Papua and East Timor and so on over the decades, not just for their own right as independence movements, but most of the concern has actually been driven by that underlying concern of the fact that the nation could so easily fragment and break into parts. So although that is not necessarily a daily concern that sits in the top of everyone's mind, it has actually underpinned quite a lot of Indonesian policy over the decades, possibly less so now that, there have been newer ways of managing those issues that have occurred in the last 20 years. So we have these issues arising. So it is pretty easy then for people to form all sorts of different dichotomies. On the one hand, you might have, the pessimist who says the humans are wonderful and warm and have their conscience and their emotions, whereas technology is amoral. Versus those who are very technologically positivist, saying, look at all the wonderful things that technology can do to liberate us, make our lives faster, better, smarter, etc. So on the one hand, we have a recent story about how technology killed journalism, and then, on the other hand, we have another example of how artificial intelligence will transform news and journalism, and we can use this so well to keep our governments accountable and so on. So this is where we stand with this. But so Ramos, who is an Australian academic, studies globalisation, says that, the answer is to look at the fact that humanity is actually to say we are technology. Since the invention of fire, since the invention of the wheel and all those simple technologies from many thousands of years ago, that was what actually separated us from animals. And that is how our humanity is defined, our ability to use tools to sort of create better lives and organise our communities. And we instead need to say, how do we become mature users of this technology? So in Australia, Professor Ricketson, myself and various others who were on the Journalism Education and Research Association of Australia last year wrote a submission to a federal government inquiry into public interest journalism. And we looked at the important role that government can play in supporting this. Now, part of this may be direct subsidies, such as tax benefits or reduced tariffs for the kinds of things that media organisations need, such as electricity, telecommunications, equipment and infrastructure, transport, printing paper and so on. It could be subsidies such as, recognising that certain kinds of community need support in having their voices represented, so minority group media, or certain benefits for those who publish certain types of public interest journalism. Public funded journalism, quite controversial in Australia at the moment. I guess Radio Republik Indonesia and Televisi Republik Indonesia were traditionally very much closely aligned to the government because of their funding, whereas our own Australian Broadcasting Corporation had a tradition of receiving funding but being independent, which annoyed every government that ever came to power in Australia, of course. And now there are, considerable threats. And of course, the commercial media, particularly Rupert Murdoch and his News Corporation, have always been hostile to this investment in taxpayer money, to what they see as the competition, whereas our research actually shows consistently that public media, public broadcasting such as the ABC has not actually necessarily competed or taken away from the commercial media's audience. If anything, it has created another option and a sense of what quality media is, thus an interest in continuing to use those types of media. So people who might use the ABC might then be more inclined to maintain their use of those traditional media rather than shift solely to social media. So it benefits everyone to be there. And similarly, we have had repeated surveys in Australia of the public that show the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, the SBS Special Broadcasting Service, are the most trusted of the media, that they are seen as providing important and valuable information and so on. Our final area in which governments can help is looking at underserviced markets. And in a big country like Indonesia, of course, that is important too, that the world does not become Jakarta-centric, and that there are all sorts of different groups. We have a large, majority of, Javanese, Sundanese and so on, but there are all sorts of smaller groups who might be supported that way. Then, of course, there's what news organisations should do. So the Future Today Institute did a global survey of CEOs and all sorts of other media people, and it found that actually at the moment media news organisations are by and large looking at technology in a very savvy way, but only in the sort of next 6 to 12 months, what's happening, and are very hesitant to kind of look at that longer 5 to 10 year term, obviously because of the difficulty of predicting what's happening next. But missing the fact that there are certain clear trends emerging in the fact, these conversational interfaces, and the fact that we may no longer be clicking on all sorts of buttons. We may be doing what one of my colleagues is now doing. She has trained Google Home to respond to her by saying, "Good morning, oh wise one, and, please read me today's headlines." "Yes, oh wise one, today's headlines are." And so as people do this more, the artificial intelligence we know will be big, although we don't know exactly, more automation. So there are certain trends we know which will come, even though we don't know the exact nuances. And to observe and learn more from other industries rather than focusing so intently on ourselves, because there are all sorts of other fields that we can learn from. Now, this itself is probably not so much directly about the public interest, but it allows the human, with their warm logic and their creative elements, to actually preempt the technology. And we know that storytelling must change with every technology. To tell a story from radio has always been different to TV, to print, and now to online, multimedia, phone-based apps, etc. So to be able to understand as humans how to be creative, how to use techniques like irony and humour, when to be serious. If someone is reading you the headlines, that necessarily has to be a little bit different to how you have traditionally consumed the news, whether you read it, watched it, or somehow or another engaged in it. And, we have scholars even here in Indonesia who are, experimenting with virtual reality news. There's a scholar at Universitas Multimedia Nusantara, for example, who is in the process of creating some virtual reality news that he will test with young Pemuda Indonesia. And I said, well, how do you describe this? Do they watch it? Do they read it? And I said, do they consume it? And he said, I guess you experience the story. Even those kinds of things are new things that can help us, although not directly connected to public interest, they underpin what we do. And then finally, I guess there are the issues about reclaiming the agenda. Now, I did a study that was not about public interest journalism or about technology. I did a study of how journalists in Australia were covering a speech of one controversial, highly populist and highly divisive politician called Pauline Hanson. And in this very well-publicised speech, she said quite a lot of controversial things. One of them was that basically Muslims were threatening us. We had gone up from the whole 0.5% of the population being Muslim to all of 2.2% of the population being Muslim. She did not quote that figure, but she said, we were being swamped by Muslims. That means, being flooded by Muslims. And so there was this speech. And I drew out a number of principles that, when I looked at all the stories, there were actually a surprising lack of very basic journalism applications and a lack of control of the agenda, allowing others to take control. And in this era in which humans and machines interrelate so closely, it was kind of ironic to see the incredibly poor standards of journalism that occurred in a rush at some stages. So one thing that needs to occur is, when this particular person spoke, did she even warrant the attention? Now, with the benefits of technology, I was quickly able to look at a figure that was often used. She gained 500,000 votes in the election. That makes her important. I thought, well, what does that actually really mean? So in my 2 minutes of Google searching, finding the election data, I was able to ascertain that that was 1/25th of the overall voters. But if we look at how much publicity she gained that week, then the major parties that were getting, 40%, etc., of the overall voters, they were getting far less attention, despite the fact that some of their speakers in Parliament that week actually had some quite fascinating things to say. So just a basic assessment of what this means, and with the benefit of all the technologies we have that we can so quickly start to do research, this was something ironic to me. Then looking at the emotiveness and being driven by those human elements of sensationalism and so on, without trying to work out or doing, using again the affordances of machines to look a little bit at social trends to say, when people make these dramatic claims, Donald Trump, build that wall, make America great again. Well, what does that mean? What's not great about America? When will we know when it is great again? Those kinds of things. What are we tapping into? And why do people look to the leaders who make those claims for some kind of leadership? We can start to do our social research, and these days, with all the benefits of technology, we can do so, and yet it is often not happening. Breaking down the euphemisms such as, what does build the wall mean? But two interrelated points, this whole sense of being objective and trying to find both sides of the story was one of the most shocking things to me as someone who had been a journalist and had taught journalism for such a long time, that so little was done. Journalists felt they had to get the other side of the story. So if Pauline Hanks had said, Muslims are bad and a threat, they would go to some other politician who would say, no, Muslims are nice and they are a wonderful contribution. Yet no actual fact-checking of data was occurring in very many of these stories. So 1/4 of the stories were actually just a fair and accurate representation of her speech without any fact-checking or any contextualisation at all. The other 75% was broken down into two chunks, 50% of people going to other people saying, oh yeah, so she's on the right, they go to someone more on the left. And of course, anyone who reads that says, well, of course someone on the right's going to say that. Of course someone on the left's going to say that. But it doesn't actually solve the issue. It creates some sense of artificial balance. But there was no actual fact-checking in those stories. It was only 1/4, 25%, that actually went to check, such as when she said we are being swamped, what did that mean? And only a small number of stories pointed out that actually there's only 2.2% of the population who are Muslims. Why are we concerned about this swamped? And it's a lot of deep emotional things there, but we're not at risk of being flooded anytime soon. So this whole sense of, there were a lot of data trails. I myself did a search of the Australian Bureau of Statistics and I timed it, and it took me, about 50 seconds to find the percentage of how many Muslims there were in Australia. So the journalists did not even do that much research in most cases, despite the fact that this sophistication of human and machine interaction allows us so much power these days. So the other thing was that, often interviews were used in a banal way, almost as de facto fact-checking, balance setting, rather than using what the human experience is actually about, the lived experience, drawing out the values. Why do you feel that way? What have you seen? What have you done? Why is your life changing? What do you fear? All those things that actually create passion and interest. And that emotional element that is separate from the objectivity of the machine is very important, because it's often when we are passionate that we go up and we do great things to improve our society, or sometimes when we're passionate that we do destructive things that hurt other people. So if we can actually harness those passions for our stories, we bring our readers so much more. But, again, it was almost like the human element was being used for what we wanted the machine element to do, and then there was an absence of what we actually wanted from that warm logic. Talk to all sorts of different groups in the issue. Now, journalists, like everyone, tend to meet with their own kind. So there was, when I broke down the sources, a high focus on high-level political figures, and even when going to political figures, the very top of the political ranks, whereas there had actually been a number of interesting people talking in that same week who came from different backgrounds, such as our first Muslim woman in Parliament, who is also an anti-terrorism expert, who leads anti-terrorism campaigns. So with one person saying, one new member of Parliament saying, oh, be fearful of Muslims and you can't trust them and it's scary and dangerous, here we have the perfect opportunity of someone who actually networks with actual potential terrorists and does anti-terrorism campaigns and is very knowledgeable, who's being overlooked in all of those stories. So that's one of those great ironies again, and using the machines to expand beyond our own personal comfort zones of who we know and who we personally have connections with. Choosing story angles. Now the focus on, I guess, the angle that, Hansen herself had promoted. If we plug those stories into machines, they will just stick very much with what they're given. And there have been examples, of course, of many stories that are now automated. A human doesn't write them, so you can give them the sports figures, a football figures. You can give them finance figures, and a lot of those stories are now written by machines rather than humans, with standard template structures of how do we structure this story. These are the kinds of elements of the warm logic and the intuition of a human that are important. And yet I didn't see that being as strongly represented. It was just almost like a machine had handed over responsibility to Pauline Hanson to set the agenda. And then we said yes or no, and we critiqued it, or we may have checked the facts or done other things. But the agenda was still being set by the primary information source. Thus, it was actually something a machine could have done, even though humans wrote these stories. And then all the background and contextual information was missing. Now, I might say Pauline Hanson made her speech at 5 p.m. at night. So, of course, there's always that rush. Radio wants to get out instantly. Online wants to get out instantly. TV is looking for the evening broadcasts. The newspapers are going for the next morning's publications. So they didn't have a lot of time. So to a certain extent, in the first day's coverage, you could have excused a lot of these mistakes. But one thing I noted was really interesting when I broke the stories up between those that were about business and economics versus those that targeted general audience. Even the next day's newspaper had very sophisticated analysis of what her kind of claims about, let's restrict immigration, let's do this, because it affects the business community. The business community is very much in favour of multiculturalism, people coming in with their skills, people coming in from diverse societies so that we in Australia can connect to all sorts of other cultures and do business appropriately with them. So they're very much in favour of this, and they don't like Pauline Hanson. So all those stories had really sophisticated agendas, lots of complex fact-checking, lots of different ranges of sources from the grassroots to the leaders, and they managed to do it for the newspapers the next morning. But for general news, the imperative, the initiative, the demand, the desire for it actually wasn't there. So I think, it can be done, that we can actually use this connection better. And of course, Chris Smith points to the fact that there is a lot of doom and gloom about technology and the bad things that can result of it. He actually says, let's look now at different ways we can start to use this for the public interest. And he gives the example of the American Black Lives Matter movement, that this could never have germinated to start off with without all the information coming from small sources, and then the amalgamation together, and then, multiple people coming together and being able to influence power. So I'll leave it there as the kind of different elements that I feel should or need to be addressed in this environment in terms of being more sophisticated in our human and machine interaction and the possibilities that are offered to us in the digital age.
Thank you. Thank you very much again.